Have you ever walked past someone without truly seeing them? A man on a bench, a woman in line, quiet, ordinary, invisible. But what if behind that silence lived a story of bravery, sacrifice, and love so profound it could change how you see the world? In a sleepy Midwest town where time moves slow and traditions held tight, a forgotten veteran named Samuel Whitaker came to the Memorial Day parade for one final goodbye. No one knew who he was, no one stopped, until one Marine did. What followed was not just a salute, it was a moment of reckoning, of remembrance, and of honor long overdue. This isn't just the story of a man, it's the story of all those who served without asking for credit, of every hero who returned home quietly and faded into the background. But on this day, the silence broke, and the whole town stood still to remember. Because sometimes the loudest tribute comes from a moment of complete silence. And sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones we forget to see until it's almost too late. He sat quietly at the far end of Main Street. No signs announced his presence, no applause welcomed him. Only a faded military jacket, a weathered wheelchair, and a pair of eyes that had seen too many battlefields and far too few moments of peace. People walked past him without a second glance. A few offered polite, passing looks, but none paused long enough to really see him. To them, he was just another old man parked at the edge of the Memorial Day parade. But Sam wasn't there to watch the floats. He came to say goodbye. The parade carried on as it always had, familiar, comforting, and unchanged by time. Then something happened. In the middle of the procession, just as the cadence of drums and cheers reached its peak, the Marines stopped marching. One officer stepped out of formation. No hesitation, no fanfare. He walked straight toward that silent figure in the wheelchair and stood tall before him. Then, in full view of the crowd, he saluted. What followed took the entire town by surprise. 47 Marines, one after another, broke rank and approached the old man. They stood in formation, not before a parade route, but before a legacy. The air grew still. Conversations died out. Phones lowered. No one quite understood why they were watching in silence, but every heart in Redfield instinctively knew. They were standing before a man who had once done something extraordinary. A forgotten hero had been seen again. Redfield, Nebraska wasn't the kind of town that made the news. It rested quietly in the middle of wheat country, nestled under skies that seemed to stretch forever without interruption. It had just two stoplights, a modest post office that closed early on Fridays, and a diner where the regulars still paid in cash, sliding dollar bills beneath coffee mugs as if the world hadn't changed much since the 60s. The town had been slowly shrinking since the late 1980s, but those who remained weren't in a hurry to leave. There was a kind of stillness in Redfield, an understanding that history lingered in its quiet corners. People stayed because they remembered. Every year, Redfield held its Memorial Day parade. It wasn't elaborate. No confetti cannons or television coverage. No celebrity grand marshals. Just tradition. The middle school band played songs they'd practiced for months. Kids with trombones slightly out of tune and hearts beating too fast. The local fire department rolled down Main in polished red engines. And always, always the veterans. They were the soul of the parade. Men in their 70s, 80s, even 90s. Some still steady on their feet, others leaning on canes, others slowly maneuvering walkers. They wore old uniforms with frayed cuffs and faded patches, holding their shoulders as straight as their bodies allowed. By 10 a.m., folding chairs lined the sidewalks, claimed early by families who believed in showing up for their town. Strollers jostled along uneven pavement. Grandparents clutched tiny American flags pulled from kitchen drawers just for this day. Children ran between the knees of adults, faces painted, laughter echoing off storefronts that hadn't been painted in years. The banners fluttered, left over from last year, their edges curling, their colors softened by sun. It was the kind of scene you'd find in a Norman Rockwell painting if you looked past the chipped paint and the weariness that came with time. The weather couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The sky was a blanket of pale gray, sunless but warm. A soft breeze drifted through town, rustling flags on every storefront. It carried the smell of freshly cut grass and the distant sizzle of hot dogs cooking over propane flames. For Redfield, this was perfect parade weather, cool enough for those in uniform, warm enough for lawn chairs and paper fans. At the very edge of the celebration, far from the packed sidewalks and camera flashes, sat a man most had stopped noticing. Samuel Whitaker. To the few who still remembered, he was simply Sam. He was 89 now, though the way he held his shoulders spoke more of dignity than age. He wore his olive green military jacket buttoned to the collar, its creases crisp and deliberate. His pants were a size too large, sagging around legs that had grown thin. The wheelchair he sat in had long since passed its prime. No decorations, no signs, just rusted joints and rubber wheels that squeaked when they turned. To most, he looked like another aging veteran from a nearby nursing home, perhaps wheeled here by habit or confusion. But that wasn't Sam. He still lived on his own, just 3 blocks from Maine, in a little house with peeling white paint and a yard full of bird feeders. He came to the parade every year, 10 years running, always by himself, always without a word. No one ever asked him why. Sam never offered a reason. Long ago, people would wave when they saw Sam. There was a time when his name meant something in Redfield, when children whispered stories about the soldier who had returned but never really spoke of what he'd seen. But years rolled by, faces changed, generations grew up without knowing his name or what he had sacrificed. And the town without meaning to, forgot him. But Sam remembered. He remembered everything. He was born in the spring of 1930 in a farmhouse with walls that groaned in the wind, sitting quietly between barley fields and gravel roads about 20 minutes outside Redfield. Life was modest back then, tough but honest. He and his older brother Thomas grew up waking before the sun, feeding chickens before breakfast, milking cows before school. Their hands blistered young, their backs learned labor before their voices deepened. They were taught early that men didn't complain, they endured. Their father, a stoic man of few words, believed respect was earned through work and silence. And Sam, even as a child, carried that belief like armor. He never forgot where he came from, and he never expected the world to remember him. But on that Memorial Day morning, beneath a sunless sky, something shifted. A town that had unknowingly turned away suddenly turned toward him again. And in that moment, without saying a word, Samuel Whitaker was no longer invisible. He was honored, not for what he looked like now, but for who he had once been. Samuel Whitaker, a man of few words and deep resolve, was raised under the stern but steady hand of a World War I veteran father. That kind of love wasn't soft. It was shaped by hard work, sacrifice, and discipline. No hugs, no long talks, but a relentless sense of duty woven into every expectation, every yes, sir, every quiet nod at the dinner table. By the time Sam turned 15, his older brother had already followed the call of service, eager to trade cornfields for camo and live out the legacy their father hung by the front door. His uniform always pressed, always waiting. But Thomas never came home. In October 1950, a letter arrived. No one dared to read it out loud, but the meaning was unmistakable. The words Korea, ambush, and flag-draped coffin hung in the silence like storm clouds. Their father, stone-faced, folded the letter once and tucked it beneath his Bible. Their mother didn't say a word for 3 full days. Then, on the morning Sam turned 18, exactly 2 weeks later, he rose before dawn, laced up his brother's boots, and walked 12 miles to Redfield to enlist in the United States Marine Corps. No speeches, no farewell. Just a solemn nod from his father and a quiet, trembling prayer from his mother as he stepped off the porch and into a future unknown. Korea wasn't what the movies promised. There was no glory. Only mud, frostbite, and the kind of fear that clung to your ribs and never let go, even after the last shot was fired. Assigned to the 5th Marines, Sam proved himself quickly. Disciplined, reliable, and eerily calm in the chaos. Some whispered he was too quiet, but he never hesitated, not even when others did. One bitter morning in late 1951 burned itself into his memory. His unit had been ambushed near the Chongjiang River, the air choked with gunfire and smoke. Men scattered. Sam didn't. He saw Corporal Davis fall first, then Lieutenant Aaron Gaines, a fresh-faced kid barely old enough to shave. Sam ran straight into the hail of bullets, dragging Davis to shelter behind a fallen log. Blood soaked his hands. Then he spotted Gaines, unconscious beneath the debris, exposed and vulnerable. No hesitation. Sam charged through open ground, gunfire tearing the air around him, and somehow carried both men nearly 400 yards to the extraction point. They tried to honor him. A medal, a ceremony. He refused it all. "I just did what I was trained to do," was all he'd say. When the war ended, Sam didn't chase a college degree or a city job. He came back to Redfield, quietly. He bought a small patch of land with his pension and fixed radios for a living. He never married, never had children, never spoke of Korea. To the folks around town, he was just Sam, the quiet man who fed the birds and walked to the post office every morning at 7:15, rain or shine. But once a year, he had a ritual. He'd take out his old uniform, press every crease by hand, polish the brass until it gleamed, and hang it back neatly in the closet. He never wore it. Until today. Something had changed. A week earlier, he received news he kept to himself. The cancer had returned, aggressive this time. He declined treatment, turned down the hospital bed. He didn't want to fade away in sterile rooms hooked up to machines. He didn't want to be remembered as a patient. He wanted one last morning as the man he had always been, in his uniform, not to be recognized, not to be honored, just to sit quietly and say goodbye on his own terms. It was Thursday afternoon when Clara Jo heard the knock, slow, deliberate, unfamiliar. In Redfield, people didn't knock. They hollered from the porch or let the screen door slap behind them. She opened it with a touch of caution, expecting maybe a student or a package delivery. Instead, there stood Samuel Whitaker, cane in one hand, hat tucked respectfully under his arm. She blinked. In the 3 years she'd lived next door, they'd exchanged nothing more than a polite nod or a soft hello. He kept to himself. No fuss, no noise, just the man who fed the birds and made the same quiet loop around the neighborhood each morning. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, her eyebrows rising. "Is everything all right?" He nodded, his voice low but clear. "Clara Jo, I know this is sudden," he said, his voice gentler than usual, "but I was wondering, would you mind taking me into town Sunday morning for the parade?" There was a pause, not awkward, but full, weighted. Something had shifted in his tone. It wasn't weariness exactly, but something more final, like a door quietly closing. Clara Jo noticed immediately. She blinked, caught a breath. "Of course," she replied. "I'd be happy to." "You don't have anyone else who can?" she asked carefully. "No one else left," he answered simply. Then after a moment he added, "And I'd like to wear my uniform, if that's not too much trouble." Clara Jo didn't press further. She didn't ask why, though part of her wanted to. Instead, she gave a soft nod and offered a small, sincere smile. "What time should I come over?" 7 sharp, he replied. "Takes me a while these days." That Sunday morning, Clara Jo showed up early, a stainless steel travel mug of coffee, warming one hand while nerves quietly simmered in the other. She couldn't quite explain why she was nervous. It was just a ride into town, wasn't it? A simple favor. But when Sam opened the door, she immediately understood. It wasn't just a ride. He stood before her in full dress uniform, olive drab, meticulously pressed. The fit wasn't perfect anymore. Age and time had reshaped his frame, but every crease was deliberate, every button polished until it gleamed. A single, dignified row of service ribbons sat proudly above his left breast pocket. Hanging just beneath the collar, partly obscured by the wear of time, was the insignia of the United States Marine Corps. As she knelt to help him sit and lace his shoes, her fingers brushed against something tucked in his inner jacket pocket. A small velvet box. She glanced at it, then at Sam. He noticed. "Go ahead," he said softly, lifting one shoulder in a shrug. Inside the box, resting on deep blue velvet, was a silver star. Nestled beneath it was a carefully folded, yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Marine carries 2 through gunfire, refuses medal ceremony." She looked up, her eyes wide, her voice caught somewhere between awe and disbelief. "This was you?" Sam didn't answer right away. Then, with a quiet nod, he said simply, "Did what I had to. That was a long time ago." Clara Jo felt her throat tighten. Words fluttered at the edge of her tongue, but none felt right. So she said nothing. Instead, she helped him into his wheelchair, gently straightened his collar, and brushed a faint speck of dust from his sleeve. Just as they were about to leave, Sam lifted a hand. One moment. She stepped back, giving him space as he wheeled himself slowly toward the hallway mirror. He paused there, really looking at the reflection before him. Not a glance, not a check, but a full, honest gaze. Then with deliberate grace, he raised his hand in a silent salute. No fanfare, no witness but her. Just a man quietly facing a life that had cost him more than most would ever understand. Clara Jo felt her chest tighten, a sudden sting behind her eyes that she fought to blink away. They didn't speak on the drive into town. They didn't need to. The silence wasn't heavy. It was sacred. Main Street was already alive by the time Clara Jo carefully wheeled Sam into position near the edge of the crowd. His spot had been chosen with care, a block past the main crowd near the bend in the parade route, just before it looped around the church green, a place both quiet and full of meaning. The sidewalks were already a patchwork of picnic blankets and folding chairs. Children darted between flagpoles and food vendors. The air smelled like buttered popcorn, cut grass, and hot dogs. And everywhere, woven into ponytails, stapled to stroller handles, clutched in tiny fists, fluttered hundreds of miniature American flags. This was Redfield on Memorial Day. Familiar, predictable, comforting. The parade always started the same way. At exactly 11 o'clock a.m., the sheriff's cruiser eased forward, its lights flashing red and blue against the soft gray sky. Behind it came two antique tractors from the Redfield Museum, engines growling, driven by men with more rust in their knees than in the machines. Next came the school band, 46 kids stringing together as much pride as they did out-of-tune notes. Their uniforms, gold and purple, were a size too big, their rhythm a little too bold, but their energy unapologetically pure. Clara Jo smiled at the sight of her students among them, wide-eyed eighth graders giving it their all on trumpets and snare drums. Parents clapped from the curb. Grandparents waved from their lawn chairs. Candy rained from floats like confetti, and kids scrambled into the street, laughing and squealing as they chased it like treasure. Near the fire trucks, a gray-bearded veteran in a weathered leather vest threw his arms around a young man in camouflage, fresh from basic training. The crowd on one side of the street erupted in cheers. Farther along, a slow-moving line of older veterans marched 2 by 2. Their steps were careful but proud. Some waved. Others kept their gaze steady ahead. They needed no applause, but they received it anyway. And Sam sat quietly a block beyond it all. He didn't wave, he didn't speak, he just watched. And in the reflection of his eyes, Clara Jo could see it all. The echoes of old parades, old friends, and battles no one ever fully came back from. He had chosen the quiet edge of the town square, away from the noise, the cameras, and the polished speeches. Clara Jo had gently suggested they sit closer to the main festivities, maybe near the bandstand or where the mayor would be waving. But Sam had simply said, "Here's just fine," in that soft, even tone she knew well. She didn't argue. She never did when he spoke like that. He sat upright in his wheelchair, hands resting calmly in his lap. The breeze toyed with his old, well-pressed jacket, making the fabric flutter slightly. The medals pinned to his chest, few, small, and unpretentious, caught the sunlight just long enough to gleam before fading back into shadow. His face was composed, distant, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. As the parade rolled on, Clara Jo noticed the subtle shifts around them. A handful of people did glance in their direction. Some offered tentative nods, unsure if they recognized him or simply felt like they should. A few children stared for a moment, eyes wide with curiosity, before being tugged away by distracted parents. One man holding a soda cup raised a hand in a short wave and moved on without waiting for a response. Not a single person stopped. No one asked his name. And maybe that was what broke Clara Jo's heart the most. Because this man, this quiet, weathered figure beside her, had once saved lives in battle. His name could have belonged in a history book. He had faced what few dared to imagine and returned with more than scars. And yet, here he was, just another old man in a wheelchair, unnoticed during speeches about courage, sacrifice, and heroism. No sign marked his place. No announcement honored him. He was invisible in the very celebration meant to honor people like him. She watched him closely. He didn't show bitterness. There was no resentment in his eyes, only a kind of calm recognition, an understanding of the way time fades even the brightest memories. He hadn't come for applause. He hadn't even come to be seen. He came to remember, to honor, to let go of some things perhaps, or to carry others forward quietly. The parade pressed on. The music swelled. Scouts marched in proud, clumsy lines. Firemen sprayed mist from hoses, delighting squealing kids. Flags waved in every direction. The world celebrated loudly around him. But Sam remained unmoved, still, solid, like a statue no one had ever bothered to name, a living monument being passed over, as if his part in history had been boxed away and forgotten. Until something changed, something no one could have predicted. The parade was still in full swing, floats gliding down Main Street, kids scrambling for candy, the mayor grinning and waving like a cartoon come to life from the back of a bright red convertible. When the sound began, a rhythmic, thunderous cadence of boots on pavement, echoing through storefronts, slicing through the chatter like a blade. The Marines had arrived, 47 of them, marching in full-dress blues, 4 across, perfect formation. Eyes forward, shoulders back, steps in flawless sync. Their entrance shifted everything. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Laughter faded. Respect swept the crowd like a hush of wind. Parents whispered to their kids to stand still. A few older veterans took off their caps in silent tribute. Clara Jo turned. Sam hadn't moved an inch, but she saw it, the way his fingers curled ever so slightly around the armrest of his chair. A quiet tension. His face stayed calm, but his eyes locked on the approaching unit, tracking them like ghosts stepping out of memory. The Marines marched past the crowd near the square, past the mayor's car, past the flags and the bandstand, heading straight down Main Street towards Sam. And then it happened. When they were no more than 20 feet away from him, the lead officer shot a hand into the air, a crisp, sharp signal, immediate, controlled, final. The unit froze, boots halted mid-step. The pounding rhythm ceased. Silence fell like a blanket. Murmurs spread. A woman whispered, "Why'd they stop?" A man asked, "Is it over?" Confused children looked around. Even the mayor frowned, glancing toward his aides for some cue. But Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Gaines didn't hesitate. He stepped out from the front line with quiet authority, adjusted his belt, and turned, away from the parade, away from the expected route, and walked directly toward Sam. Clara Jo's breath caught in her throat. Around them, the crowd instinctively parted. People didn't speak. They didn't move. It felt like something sacred had been set in motion. The officer moved with purpose, with reverence. And when he reached Sam's chair, he stood at attention, feet together, hands at his sides, eyes locked straight ahead. He didn't speak. Not yet. He just sat there, quiet and still, like he always did. For 10 straight years, this lone man had watched every town parade from the far end of Main Street. Never waving a flag, never asking for attention, just a faded uniform and a distant look. And then for the first time, someone spoke. With a voice that carried without a microphone, Elijah Gaines stepped forward and turned slightly so the man in the crowd could hear him clearly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and strong, "you don't know this man, but without him, I wouldn't be standing here." Main Street fell into a hush so profound it was as if the pavement itself held its breath. In 1951, Elijah continued, during the Korean War, my father, Lieutenant Aaron Gaines, was pinned down in a ravine during an ambush. He was hit twice. There was no cover, no reinforcements, no hope. His voice remained firm, but a quiet edge of emotion began to crack through as he paused, steadying himself. "But one Marine," he said slowly. "One man ran toward the gunfire. He dragged my father out. Then, without stopping, he carried another wounded soldier nearly 400 yards through open fire." Elijah's voice trembled, but the words stayed strong. He saved 2 lives that day. And when it was over, he refused a medal, refused a ceremony, refused any recognition. Phones hovered midair, forgotten in people's hands. The silence deepened, still, reverent, and raw. Elijah turned fully to face the man in the wheelchair. That man is Staff Sergeant Samuel Whitaker. And today, his voice softened, we are not here to honor a parade. We are here to honor him. A quiet gasp rippled through the crowd. Clara Jo looked around, her chest tight. The people around her, stunned, tearful, were frozen in a moment none of them had expected. A woman clutched her heart. A young boy looked up at his father, who simply nodded once, eyes misty with understanding. Elijah continued, his voice thick with meaning. Every year we march in a unit named after him. We are the Delaney platoon because my father made sure that name would never be forgotten. And neither should this one. He turned back to Sam, stepping aside just slightly. My father lived because of this man. I was born because of this man. And we march today because of this man. He stopped speaking. There was nothing more to say, and yet everything that followed would be remembered for the rest of their lives. There were no shouted commands, no sharp calls. Yet every Marine at the formation began moving at the same moment, as if pulled by something unseen but deeply understood. One by one they stepped forward, deliberate, measured steps, toward the aging veteran in the wheelchair. Each man, a portrait of pride and discipline, stopped before Samuel Whitaker, shoulders squared, chin lifted. The first, a young corporal with freckles and fire in his eyes, brought his right hand up in a crisp, perfect salute. Thank you, Sergeant Whitaker, he said clearly. Sam blinked. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came. His hand trembled where it rested on his lap. Slowly, painfully, he lifted it. It wasn't quick, it wasn't sharp, but it was perfect. The salute held. The corporal lowered his hand, stepped aside, and the next Marine took his place. Then the next, and the next. Each one moved with silent resolve. One step forward, one salute, one clear, solemn thank you. No medals were mentioned, no battles recounted. Just two simple words. Thank you. Thank you, Sergeant Whitaker. Thank you, Sergeant Whitaker. Thank you. Clara Jo stood off to the side, hands clasped over her mouth, her shoulders shaking as silent sobs escaped. The tears streamed freely now. Around her, the crowd remained frozen in reverent silence. The mayor had removed his hat. The band was silent. Even the children, just moments ago restless and playful, now stood still, holding their flags like sacred relics. And Sam, he never said a word. He didn't need to. His arm kept rising slower each time, shaking more with every salute. But he did not stop. His shoulder sagged. The muscles in his aging arm trembled, but the fire in him held. By the 10th Marine, his lips quivered with emotion. By the 20th, his eyes brimmed with tears. By the 30th, Clara Jo quietly stepped behind him and placed a hand gently on his shoulder, not to steady him, but simply to let him know he wasn't alone. Still the salutes came. Each Marine spoke his name. Each gave his thanks, then stepped aside, 47 times. No music, no applause, not even birdsong. Just the sound of respect echoing down the soul of the street. Sam hadn't asked for attention. In fact, for years after the war, he had managed to live in Redfield almost like a shadow, always present, always kind, but never really seen. He fixed radios when they stopped working, left extra seed in the church bird feeders without being asked, shoveled the sidewalk in front of his little house every winter, slow and quiet, never requesting help. At every Memorial Day parade, he stood silently, not for himself, but for those who never made it back. And yet not once had anyone really looked at him. That all changed in a single suspended moment, when the parade paused mid-march and every eye turned toward the man in the wheelchair. The same man they'd passed countless times on the sidewalk. The one they'd assumed was simply another vet, old, quiet, unremarkable. But now, for the first time, they saw the small cluster of medals on his chest, modest but heavy with meaning. They saw how war had left its imprint on his posture, how pain and memory had settled into his bones. They noticed the discipline in the way he held his salute, and the strength it took just to keep his hand raised. And perhaps more than anything, they recognized the echo of themselves in him, in who they had overlooked, in what they'd forgotten. Sam's final salute wasn't to be rushed. As the last Marine passed by, a broad-shouldered sergeant with dark eyes stopped in front of him. He held his own salute and spoke just loud enough to carry between them. "Sir, it is an honor." Sam lifted his arm again, slower now. His wrist trembled hard. Clara Joe instinctively reached forward, embraced his elbow without saying a word. He held the salute longer than was needed, longer than his body could easily manage, then finally lowered his hand to his chest and exhaled, deep and full. There were no cheers, no clapping, only silence. Reverent, almost sacred silence. And in that stillness, something inside Redfield shifted. Sam hadn't just been remembered. The town had awakened. A quiet place found its voice again, by finally listening. By the time Clara Joe wheeled Sam home, the sun had dropped below the tree line. The parade streets had emptied. The chairs lining the sidewalks sat folded and forgotten, left behind like echoes. Candy wrappers skittered along the pavement in the soft wind, the laughter of children already faded with the dusk. Neither spoke on the drive. Sam sat in the passenger seat, uniform still crisp, gaze distant. Not at the town rolling past his window, but beyond it, into something invisible, something only he could see. When they reached his house, Clara Joe parked out front and carefully helped him out. He moved slower now, more deliberate. Every step held purpose, the weight of the day pressing on him. But not once did he complain. Inside, everything remained exactly as it always had. The soft ticking of the kitchen clock, the faint scent of old wood and lavender, the faded black and white photograph of two boys beside a tractor still hung by the sink. Clara helped him off with his jacket and reached for the medals still pinned to his chest, but he stopped her gently. "Leave them," he said, almost a whisper. "They can stay there tonight." She nodded. Instead of heading straight to bed, Sam wheeled himself over to the little table by the front window. The porch light spilled across the room in a quiet glow. From a drawer, he pulled out a small photograph, its corners bent, edges worn smooth by time. It was a picture of him, decades younger, caked in Korean mud, laughing, his arm thrown around a friend who wasn't in the frame. It was the only photo he'd ever kept from the war. Later, Clara helped him to bed. He moved with unexpected ease, like something heavy inside him had been set down. She pulled the covers over him gently. "Thank you," he murmured, so soft she almost missed it. "For bringing me." She held his hand. "I think you brought all of us somewhere today, Sam." He gave a faint smile, not of pride, but of peace. Clara stepped into the hallway, pausing for a second, unsure if she should wait, unsure if he might need something else. She didn't know this would be the last time she'd see him alive. That night, Samuel Whitaker passed in his sleep. No hospital room, no machines, no pain, just stillness. He was found the next morning, exactly as he had left the world, hands folded over his chest, the photograph resting near his heart. His dress uniform hung neatly by the door, medals still pinned, glinting softly in the morning light. Clara Joe called the sheriff, then the mayor. By noon, the story had already begun to ripple through Redfield. The video spread like wildfire. Multiple people had captured the moment, 47 Marines stepping forward, one by one, to honor a man they never met. By nightfall, the footage was everywhere. First shared among locals, then picked up by veteran groups, and eventually featured by national outlets hungry for something genuine. Headlines echoed the sentiment. A salute for the forgotten. One man, one final tribute. The parade that paused. And just like that, Samuel Whitaker, who once lived in the quiet corners of town, who fed birds and carefully pressed his uniform behind closed doors, was no longer invisible. He had become a symbol, a silent beacon for those who serve without recognition. Redfield had noticed him. Now the world had too. 3 days later, the small chapel on the outskirts of Redfield held a funeral unlike any it had ever seen. Not for a wedding, not for Christmas, not for any death in memory had the building overflowed like this. By noon, every pew was occupied. People crammed along the back, shoulder to shoulder, spilling out onto the steps and sidewalks. Farmers in work boots, kids in scout uniforms, elderly veterans wearing faded jackets, heavy with honor. Flags lined the path to the door, held by hand, pinned to fences. But there were no campaign banners, no camera crews, no reporters breaking the silence. The atmosphere was sacred, still, reverent. The mayor gave a short tribute, but it was Colonel Elijah Gaines who delivered the words that lingered. He never asked for this, he said. He never wanted it. But a man like Staff Sergeant Samuel Whitaker doesn't belong to silence forever. He belongs to memory, to all of us. Behind him, the 47 Marines from Delaney Platoon stood in a final formation. No rifles, no commands, just presence. When the service ended, the townspeople didn't rush off. They stayed. They lined the street as Sam's flag-draped casket, covered in the very same banner he had folded countless times, was rolled gently through town. No one waved. No one spoke. They just stood. And when the procession reached Sam's porch, the one where he'd sat for years unnoticed, the Marines paused. Silently, each removed his cover and saluted. Not to the casket, but to the porch itself. That evening, something subtle shifted in Redfield. Clara Jo noticed the post office flag lowered to half-staff at sunset. Then the one at the diner, then the garage next door. By the next day, it was a quiet ritual. Night after night, flags lowered, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Soon after, a mural appeared. A 22-year-old local artist asked for permission to paint the side of the old hardware store. At first, it was just Sam's portrait, brushed in warm, earthy tones. But as the weeks passed, it grew. A young Marine carrying a wounded comrade. A line of salutes beneath a rising flag. They called it the Silent Watchman. Children stopped and stared. Veterans placed their hands on their hearts. Strangers from distant towns drove in just to witness it. Clara Jo changed too. In her classroom, she hung a photo of Sam, not the one in the wheelchair, but the young man in Korea, caked in mud, grinning despite exhaustion, strength etched beneath weariness. She started each school year with his story, not as a history lesson, but as something living. She made her students learn every veteran's name from their town, not just his, because she understood now, heroes don't always march to drum beats. Sometimes they wait quietly, hoping someone will see them. True service doesn't demand attention. It doesn't boast or seek validation. It shows up early. It works hard. It lifts others when they fall and slips back into the shadows without fanfare. Samuel Whitaker never asked to be remembered. But in remembering him, we remember them all. They were the ones who gave everything and never asked for anything in return. Men and women who shouldered the invisible weight of battlefields far from home. They carried with them the burden of duty, the scars of grief, the silence of memories they were too painful to speak aloud. And still, not once did they raise their hand to be called heroes. These are the people who quietly returned from war and blended back into the world they left behind. Today, they may live just down your street. They might sit alone on a bench, unnoticed, gazing at the horizon with eyes that have seen too much. You might see them stand a little straighter when a flag passes by, offering nothing more than a silent nod. But in that moment, their entire story is there. So we ask you this: who is your town's Sam Whitaker? Is there a veteran in your neighborhood, a soft-spoken man at the corner store, a retired teacher, a janitor who always shows up early, or maybe a grandmother who never talks about what she did before she held your hand? Someone who served with courage and humility, never needing applause, never demanding recognition. If you know someone like that, speak their name in the comments. Let us say it out loud together. Let the world know their story. Let them be seen. And if this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of someone you love or someone you've passed by without knowing, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who believes in honoring those quiet giants among us. Tell us in the comments below about someone who never wore their medals, but whose every step reflected the weight of honor. Someone who didn't need a ceremony to prove they had served. Because remembering isn't something we reserve for a single day on a calendar. It's a daily choice to look again, to notice, to care, to ask, to listen. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.